everybody. I've got the great pleasure to now introduce Dr. Paul Smith. He's a specialist in ecology and plant diversity in Southern, Central and also Eastern Africa. Dr. Smith is the head of Kew's Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, which is a network of over 120 plant science institutions in 55 countries. The extraordinary thing is actually that already in 2009, this partnership has assured to store seeds from 10% of the world's plant species, and then plan over the next 10 years to actually secure 25% of all the world's flora in seed banks and enable that to be used for research. The title of Paul's talk today is Kew's Millennium Seed Bank, Supporting Innovation and Adaptation in Horticulture in a Changing World. The scope and ambition of the seed bank project makes it such an incredible endeavor for the 21st century. Later today, we will then hear the artist Silke Otto-Knapp. Her contribution was inspired by her frequent visits to another fantastic branch of Kew Gardens, the Marianne North Gallery. A very, very warm welcome to Dr. Paul Smith.
Thanks very much, Hans. To paraphrase Monty Python now for something completely different from what came before. And I want you please to suspend all philosophical questions and think pragmatism, because what I'm about to present is really about what Kew is doing in a pragmatic sense about looking after and enabling the use of plant diversity. So what I want to just set the scene with is the context, and that is diminishing plant diversity, which is one of the big environmental issues, Kew's role, what we're doing about it through the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, and then give you some examples of how we both conserve and enable the use of plant diversity in the broad sense in horticulture. And I'll finish with a very few simple conclusions. Many of you are aware, of course, of deforestation. It gets a lot of coverage in the press. It's actually very difficult to prove that a plant species has become extinct. You have to search every square meter of ground, but the best that we have is around 650 plant species confirmed as extinct over the last 400 years. That is about 70 times what you would expect from the fossil record. So we're in a mass extinction phase, and it's caused by people, as I'll explain in a moment. And we know that those extinctions are certainly under-recorded. The best estimates that we have come from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2006, and then some of Kew's work over the last 5 years, and that suggests that about 20% of plant species are currently threatened with extinction in the wild, and that is somewhere around 100,000 plant species. The causes are largely to do with land use change, and actually deforestation gets a lot of publicity, as I say, but it's land use change in general. It's not just forests, but it's clearing of primary vegetation. It also includes the way that we manage the land which we occupy, so that will include desertification, for example, in places like the Sahel. And with it goes plant diversity. I guess the fundamental question for us is, why should we care? Why does it matter? And I think most people understand that plants provide us with our food. For those of you who've had lunch already or breakfast, I guarantee you will have eaten plants. Many of you will be wearing plants. Most of us understand that our fuel, food, and so on comes from plants. But of course, we increasingly understand how important they are in the ecology of the planet, in regulating services, in supporting services, and they're culturally important to us as well. We shouldn't forget that. Fundamentally, all life depends upon plants, and economists, and I think we all realize that economics is a fairly imprecise science, have tried to put a value on plant diversity and come up with this improbable figure of $30 to $40 trillion per annum. The fact is they're priceless because we cannot live without plants. We're also in a precarious position in the way that we interact with plants, and increasingly we rely on fewer and fewer species. And if 80% of our calorie intake comes from just 12 plant species, you can probably name them. 8 of them are grains and 4 of them are tubers. We have to ask ourselves whether we can continue to rely on such a tiny fraction of plant diversity for all of our future needs, for humanity, way into the future as long as we intend to exist on this planet. We know that at least 30,000 species of plants are edible and can be eaten by people, but most of them are not in seed banks, most of them are out in the wild, most of them are not cared for. The same is true with medicines. We forget that 3/4 of the world rely on traditional medicines, and many of them we know are efficacious, they work. We don't necessarily know how they work, but there's some figures there from China and India. And again, most of these are collected from the wild. Most of them are not conserved either in situ or in seed banks. And perhaps most important of all, plant-based solutions will be required for all of the big environmental challenges. You know, we get bombarded all of the time with these big questions about food security, water scarcity, energy, all of those things. And plants, as I'll show, are fundamental to solving those problems. Now, Kew's role, and I have a picture here of Sir Joseph Banks. Kew has been in existence for about 250 years. One of the pioneers was Sir Joseph Banks. And initially, Kew Gardens was set up to exploit plants, to move plants around the empire back in history. But fundamentally, we were there to find out more about plants and how people can use those plants. And our mission is still to inspire and deliver science-based plant conservation worldwide to enhance the quality of life. And our role is to enable human innovation, and to enable us to adapt, and ultimately to enable us to be resilient and to hang around as a species. But much more focused than that, our role primarily is in providing plant-based solutions to the challenges that we face. So the Millennium Seed Bank Partnership, as Hans said, is a global program, 123 partner institutions in 54 countries. And we realized very early on that we couldn't march into other people's countries and tell them what they should be doing with their plants. We have a much more pragmatic approach, and that's a bilateral program where every single partnership that we have overseas depends on their national priorities. Which species are we going to work on, which species are we going to put in the seed banks, and so on. And this all sits under the Global Convention on Biological Diversity, and we have formal, legally binding agreements with partner countries that deal with the difficult issues about ownership, for example. Who owns the seed in the Millennium Seed Bank here in the UK? In most cases, it belongs to the country of origin, and it's up to them how that seed is used, which is the way that it should be. Our purpose is to combat potentially catastrophic threats to human well-being by safeguarding wild plant diversity, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, and enabling its use through our global partnership. And that translates into two main targets. The first, mentioned by Hans, is to store in safe storage 25% of the world's orthodox plant species, that's most of them, by 2020. Once in the bank, those seeds will last for 200 years on average, some of them for much longer than that. But more importantly, we need to enable the use of those plants. We're not a doomsday vault waiting for Armageddon. We're sending out seeds all of the time to support innovation in agriculture, in horticulture, in forestry, and then habitat restoration. So where are we with the 25%? Well, in 2009, we celebrated our 10% milestone with 30,000 species duplicated in our seed bank, and another 30,000, or the same 30,000, duplicated overseas. 2 billion seeds stored in a room which I would say is perhaps a quarter of the size of this. It's possible to store a lot of seed diversity in a very small place, very efficiently, running on 10 kilowatt hours of electricity. We need to add a further 45,000 species to the partnership over the next 10 years. But what is the point of holding that seed if we can't use it? As I say, one of the key things that we do is to send out seeds all of the time. And one of the sets of seeds that we send out are crop wild relatives. Crop wild relatives sounds like something that goes on at Christmas. It's actually those most closely related species to our main crops, the wheat or rice or maize that you perhaps ate for breakfast. And the reason that we need those species is because their progenitors, the wild species from which they were derived, have many useful characteristics and traits which have been lost from the domesticated ones, so disease resistance, drought tolerance, and so on. And we are working with the Global Crop Diversity Trust based in Rome over the next 10 years to systematically collect and put into the seed bank and make available for plant breeders the next generation of useful crop wild relatives that can be used to breed drought-tolerant species, disease-resistant species, and so on. There's another way that we can help with adaptation and innovation, and that is in domesticating plant species. And over the last 5 years, we've run a program called the Difficult Seeds Project in Africa, 38 sub-Saharan African countries. And we asked the seed bank managers there to come with difficult species that they couldn't grow or they couldn't store the seeds from. And when we added them up, there were 200-odd species. Most of them were native species. And the reason that people want to grow native species is because they're well adapted to local environments. They don't require fertilizer, they don't require a lot of irrigation, they don't require pesticides, and so on. But there is usually a reason they have not been domesticated. And we found, for example, of the 40 fruit trees, 33 of them were native fruit trees, and most of them people couldn't germinate. It's not a question of just adding soil and water and hoping your seed will come up. And a recent discovery over the last 5 years by Australians and South African groups has shown that, for example, if you smoke treat your seeds, germination, it will trigger germination. The Australians reckon for about a quarter of their plant species. And I have an example here from Africa. This is called Shinsi or Phyton rauteneni in Latin. Mungongo is the African name, which is a bit easier. And this is like an almond. It's produced by a 10-meter tree in profusion, been used traditionally to make a high-protein porridge since forever, but has never been cultivated. And the reason for that is because if you crack the very hard nut, you get no germination. Nothing happens. If you crack the nut and you smoke treat it, which any farmer can do who can smoke fish or meat, up it comes within a week. So that's where our science can help, is working out how to grow new species and put them into agriculture, horticulture, or forestry. Moving on to forestry, we reckon there are around 60,000 species of tree in the world, but forestry, like agriculture, is a conservative discipline. We have good knowledge of perhaps how to grow maybe 1,000 tree species, that's it. And we believe we should be investigating the other 59,000 to see whether those are more appropriate. And as I say, there are many indigenous fruit trees amongst those, for example. The Millennium Seed Bank already holds more than 10,000 species as seed, and we send out that seed to enable people to work out how to grow those species. And we can learn also about how to do it from different parts of the world. This picture is taken from the Jarrah Forest, which sits above Perth in Western Australia, and it's a bauxite mine. It's mined by Alcoa, the aluminium mining company. And over the last 40 years, under the terms of their license with the government of Western Australia, they have to put back what they remove. And first of all, it was very hard to do that because it's a diverse forest up there, over 100 species, and nobody knew how to do it. Now, 40 years on, this is what one of their plantations looks like after 18 months, and this is what it looks like when it gets to maturity. We can use that knowledge elsewhere. We can take that to Africa, we can take it to America, we can take it wherever we need to, and the partnership enables us to use that knowledge in ways that will increase our understanding generally about how we restore habitats. And catchment forests are a particularly important part of that. The UK is not exempt from these problems. The Reed report, produced 2 years ago by David Reed and colleagues, tells us that our forest cover in the United Kingdom is amongst the lowest in Europe. It's 12%, just at a time when actually we need more forests for carbon sequestration, for biomass. If those of you thinking of putting in biomass boilers, it's not straightforward getting hold of the wood chips. So we have other problems as well. We have major new pests and diseases emerging. Many of you will have heard of sudden oak death, which is not just affecting our oak trees, but it's jumping the species barrier. Red band needle blight is more worrying. We have none of our conifers here, either commercial or native, as far as we know, are resistant to red band needle blight. It's in the south at the moment, but when it gets up to Northumberland and up to Scotland, it will cause major problems in our forest monocultures. So we are already working with the Forestry Commission on collecting and trialling new species for UK forestry. We've run expeditions with our partners in Chile, in Mexico, Japan. There's a trip coming up. And we will put those species into trials to see whether they can cope with our climate, not just today, but in 40 years' time, to see whether they have resistance to some of these diseases and so on. And we will systematically continue to collect our local flora here and put it in the bank so that we don't have the situation we had with Dutch elm disease in the 1970s. And finally, habitat restoration is another branch of horticulture, if you like. And that we've just launched our UK Native Seed Hub. In this country, we have 2% of the flower-rich meadows that we had at the end of the war, largely due to intensive agriculture. Under the new government's white paper, there will be incentives put in place to help farmers to put back more of that plant diversity, which helps pollinators and helps farmers in turn. We've noticed that if you buy a seed mix and you want to put in wildflowers, you may be lucky if 50% of them germinate. You certainly won't get the full range of species that you need to be putting back into habitats. And next time that you visit Kew or you visit the seed bank, you will see fields and fields of wildflowers that we're producing to produce the seed, to provide that to the UK native seed industry for them to bulk up and multiply to go out to the industry and whoever wants to put in wild species. In conclusion, there is no technological reason why any plant species should become extinct. That is a pretty powerful statement, and that should be our null hypothesis. We have it within our means to make sure that no species becomes extinct. Seed banks such as ours are part of the answer, but only part of the answer. We need to be conserving whole communities in situ. We need to be working in our gardens to conserve them. And we need to be putting those that can't be conserved in our gardens or in nature into seed banks where we know they will survive until we learn about how we can grow them successfully. But one thing is very, very clear to us, and that is that we need plant diversity in all of its beauty. We need plant diversity in all of its utility. And I think that this generation, whatever it is, will be harshly judged by future generations if we don't pass on that biological inheritance intact, particularly given that it's within our power to do so. Thank you.